You've had a fairly interesting Jewish journey. I mean, everybody does, but yours is singular in some ways. You obviously had a very traditional sort of yeshiva background you learned for a long time, but quite clearly the person you are now is not the same person religiously in terms of the way you think as 30 to 40 years ago. Can you trace for me what happened, like where you think you were, and what were there moments, points, events, incidents, people you read that created some kind of rupture or break for you, or is it more seamless, this transition?
I think initially it was seamless, but there were internal ruptures. There were no external ruptures really, but there were internal ruptures.
Can you describe those ruptures, like from where to where?
Well, the question is where to begin, because you talked about the way I was brought up conventional yeshiva background. You could say that, but that's perhaps
So
not.
tell me where you think you began.
Began with parents who came from Eastern Europe after the war to America.
Survivors,
right? And that immediately made me feel internally as separate from my American surroundings, because at home my parents spoke Yiddish and English.
Which was your first language?
It's hard to say.
Both kind of at
Both
the same
together,
time?
both
And
at the same time.
You lived in Brooklyn?
We lived in Borough Park.
Okay.
Right? But I went to I don't know if it's but I went to you could say that it was a modern Orthodox elementary school, which doesn't exist anymore. That was Eitz Chaim in Borough Park. It was like the first Jewish day school in America, I think, which was supposed to be Ivrit B'Ivrit, but it wasn't. It was boys only. So it wouldn't be considered so modern Orthodox today, but then that was considered modern Orthodox. And from there, the natural progression is I should have gone to like one of the Yeshiva University high schools, but I didn't. I went to Flatbush High School, which was mixed. It was boys and girls, and that was already. So you can't say that that's like what you would consider a conventional yeshiva background.
Heavy emphasis on Hebrew, I think.
Yeah, heavy emphasis on Hebrew, on Zionism. Excellent education, forever indebted to the education I received there. But what I felt was lacking and what I was drawn to was Talmud study. And there wasn't enough of it there for me. And I felt there was something missing. I didn't even know enough of what it was that I was missing. But I felt I was missing that. And so when I came to Israel, I was moved to come to Israel at the end of my high school career.
You were moved internally.
Internally,
yeah,
right.
There was something pulling you.
Yeah, there was something pulling me. I was trying to learn Gemara by myself. I had no one to turn to when I was in high school. There was no one really to turn to. And when I came to Israel, I sort of found that. I found that in what was then, there was this Jewish agency program called BMT, Beit Midrash Torah. And then I moved over to Yeshivat Har Etzion, where I spent 2 years. And there I found what I was looking for in terms of intensive Gemara study. It was very difficult in the beginning. I would say it was very difficult for the first few years. So I was there for 2 years, and then I went back to Yeshiva University.
When you say difficult, you mean literally in terms of how to learn the text?
Literally how to learn the text. But emotionally, it was difficult.
How
because
so?
People coming with stronger backgrounds textually, not always aware of what it is for someone who's trying to master it, right? So even though I came with very good Hebrew, I did not come with a strong textual background. So there was also, at times, there was a competitive atmosphere, which I did not enjoy, right? But all in all, the experience was very positive. I very much connected to the yeshiva, and I connected to Rav Lichtenstein and to my chavrutot, and it was very, very positive. And when I left after 2 years, I only wanted to come back.
How old are you at this point?
19.
Ah, okay, so you're still a teenager.
Yeah. So I came to Israel when I was 17.
You come and you leave at 19 and you go back to the States?
Right, I went back to the States. I went to Yeshiva University for 2 years, undergraduate, because I wanted to get back here as fast as I could. So I finished YU in 2 years.
What was that experience like?
Yeshiva University? There were two different things. There were the friends that I had there from Israel and the learning that we kept up together, and that was very good. And just being in New York and being in Washington Heights was sort of a depressing sort of environment. There was never really identified with the Yeshiva University as an institution, although there were some very wonderful people there. I was very close with Rav Gorelik Zatzal. I was in his shir the first year that I was there, and afterwards I studied with the Rav. So I didn't have a very strong personal relationship with the Rav. I had some interactions with him, but there were many students, and but I went to the shir and I was very impacted by him. But I always wanted to come back. So after YU, I stayed in the States another year. I did a little bit of graduate school, and then I came back to Israel, and I stayed in the Gush for another 8 years. Right? Towards the end of that period, I started teaching in Grus, in Yeridea, in the Grus Center of YU.
So you're learning through your 20s, basically, at
through my
Zion,
20s at Herzl.
Right? And is your experience of yourself Jewishly, in terms of your thought, changing that period, or does it remain rather static?
It was changing. There were certain things going on, which now I can look back and see how they were turning points. Like, for example, at one stage, I used to go back and visit my parents in New York every year, and then I would always try to find myself in Barnes & Noble on Fifth Avenue and 18th Street. I don't know if it's still there. I assume it's still there. And I used to just browse through, spend the afternoon browsing through, and I would just discover books. And so there's one book that I literally stumbled upon, was a book by Moshe Elliott called The Sacred and the Profane, which reminded me of the idea of the holy, who I heard of by Rudolf Otto, who I'd heard of from the Rav. So, the sacred and the profane, that looks familiar, but it was something else. But just standing there, it caught me. I remember reading the back, the way you caress a book when you first meet it, when you first encounter it, right? So, and that was my introduction to comparative religion. And I found it very unsettling because all these concepts which I thought were uniquely Jewish, like the Beit HaMikdash, the sanctuary being the center of the world, or the sanctity of the threshold as expressed in the mezuzah, or even esoteric laws like the laws of Tumah v'Tahara, purity, impurity, ritual purity, impurity, which you thought were uniquely Jewish. There were Mishnayot buried in Masechet Kelim, and all of a sudden I saw that there were other civilizations that had similar phenomena.
Yes.
Sometimes even identical, but similar, parallel. You could see the parallels, and it unsettled me in a way which made me think, like, so what's unique about the Torah? And it was just like a little twitch, at the edge of my consciousness, I would say.
Yeah.
Pre-conscious, not unconscious,
right.
and not totally conscious, but at the pre-conscious, that borderline. It sort of irked me a little bit, and it unsettled me. And I remember I showed it to a friend of mine who was a chavruta, and we were roommates, and I showed it to him, and he read the book, and he just said, "Oh, it's kfira."
It's heresy.
Right, it's heresy.
So your study partner just passes it off
it off as heresy. Yeah. And so there's nothing more to discuss about it, but it was, that was one point, you could say.
Okay.
Right? There were other points where certain things I was hearing in yeshiva which were sort of based in the Rav's writing. I'm not talking about the Rav in his entirety, but if you talk about Isha Halacha,
Rabbi Soloveitchik
on the halachic man, the viewing of all of reality through the prism of halacha, which is what Isha Halacha is about, to the exclusion of the world of human experience and the world in general, right? To the exclusion of that. In other words, to see a sunset and not to encounter the beauty of it, but to encounter the fact that it has to do with with Tfilat Arvit or with when Yom Kippur finishes,
when holidays fall,
when all this fall, all the halachic ramifications of the natural phenomena, right, which is part of the natural phenomena, but it doesn't begin, in my mind, to encapsulate the natural phenomena. So that way of looking at things, even though in the context of studying in yeshiva, was certainly very enticing, but there's something about it that irked me, right? And I didn't know, I couldn't formulate what it was,
right?
Because I was so eager to get into that world, right?
So there's a deep irony here, right? Yeah. You want to go deeper and deeper into it. The learning obviously appeals to you, and the life appeals to you, and yet you're being prodded from the side, sort of gently,
right?
Like maybe this world that I want to enter into is not really exactly the world I want to enter into. So did you feel a distance then? Like, how do I do this? How do I integrate this? Or was it too early?
It was too early. I wouldn't say it wasn't the world that I wanted to enter into, but I want to enter into it, but not to the exclusion of you could call it the outside world, right? Not to the exclusion of that. I don't even know if I formulated it that way to myself at the time, because of course, one of the characteristics of that world, that inward world that I was trying to get into, one of the characteristics that it possesses is the exclusionary aspect.
Right.
So it's not. It's really not so simple.
Right. Let's focus on that a little bit because it's a bit complicated, right? So you see this. Obviously, the most extreme example of this is monastic life,
right?
Where you have somebody like the great 20th century monk Thomas Merton, right, who writes Seven-Story Mountain and runs off to Kentucky and basically lives as a Trappist monk there over his life, and yet is somebody who's a very acute observer of the world, but in some level, to maintain his sense of interiority, he feels he needs to cut himself off from the very world that's a fascination to him, because religiously it's a fascination because it's God's world, right? It's all of God's world. So somehow you can't make this distinction. So you're getting at a very deep irony here, which is that to somehow really experience it in a spiritual way, you can't be completely immersed in it. You somehow need that interiority, and yet if it's too interior, if it's too cut off, you lose the resonance, the richness of the world itself. You've lost that world, right? So.
Right. And if you believe that that's God's world, as this really goes, I only realize this much, much later. It really does go to fundamental questions of theology, where Yeshivat Har Etzion was obviously profoundly impacted by Rav Lichtenstein, right? So that comes out of a Lithuanian, like sort of a modern reworking of the Lithuanian yeshiva tradition. That's basically, in my mind, that's what Yeshivat Har Etzion is. It's not Volozhin, right? It didn't try to be Volozhin.
Volozhin being a 19th century example.
The 19th century example of you could say, right, the Harvard of the Litvish yeshivas, right? But it was a translation of that for the 20th century. It was with the involvement in secular studies that Rav Lichtenstein symbolized, a certain type of openness to the world, an openness to society, an appreciation for what it has to offer. But it still came from a theological place where the Torah is somehow separate from the world.
So all of that.
So that the world which is outside the 4 cubits of the law, right, where the sages say, Mishacharav Beit HaMikdash Ein LaKadosh Baruch Hu B'olamo Ela Daled Amot Shel Halacha Bilvad. From the time that the temple was destroyed, God only maintains 4 cubits of halacha in the world, which seems to the word in Hebrew is lahafkir, which seems to give up on the rest of the world. Yeah. There's a strong word. I need a stronger word than giving up. Right. It sort of leaves the rest of the world ultimately.
Abandons it.
It abandons the rest of the world as a place for divine encounter with the divine.
So what's the purpose of it there, right? Of the English literature and the secular study. What place does it hold?
Rav Lichtenstein, Halach L'Olamo, you'd have to ask him what it was for him. I don't know. I mean, I could conjecture, but in terms of my experience, so you had the theological assumption that God is found in the Dalet Amot Shel Halacha, the 4 cubits of the law, and maybe something about the world can inform me about those 4 cubits of the law, but fundamentally that's where I find God, is something that deep inside of me irked me, which I wasn't totally aware of. And now I can point to it and say it really has to do with how you understand the theology of the Tzimtzum and how
God fits into the world.
How God fits into the world.
Right.
Like how is there such a thing as totally secular space or not, right? Whereas ironically, the quote unquote more traditional Lithuanian view is there is totally secular space. And that's outside of the 4 amot of halacha, and that's where you get Isha halacha, right? Where Isha halacha lives in the holy space, and everything has to get subsumed to the holy space. But then there's like the sunset for the sunset for the beauty of it. God's not in that.
So what you're actually saying is that if we define a secular space, it's a space that's apart from the important space, which is the holy space. So it's either a space that's patronized or denigrated, or at best, it's a tool that we can reintegrate into the holy space, but it's utilitarian. Its only value is to use that stuff to somehow...
It's drafted for the purpose.
Yeah, it's drafted, right.
We will appropriate it, right? It can be appropriated for our purposes.
So there are 2 things here. One is there's no real intrinsic value to it. And the second thing, which is more troubling, is that if we're talking about everything being God's world, then just even philosophically, how do you split off a secular space and say it's somehow not holy, it's not divine, right? Which is a more problematic formulation.
Yeah.
Right.
So
So these things are sort of starting to build up in your consciousness.
Right.
But at that point, you leave Har Etzion and you begin a kind of a teaching career.
Right.
Afterwards.
Well, even in Har Etzion, I'll give you another example. There was somebody was talking about an instance where the laws of the returning of lost objects, right? If somebody loses something, so there's a positive commandment to return it to them, right? That's a mitzvah, okay? There's no mitzvah to return a lost object to someone who is not considered your comrade in observance, right? In other words, l're'echa, but l're'echa b'mitzvot. So if the person is considered outside the pale, in the context of whatever it was in the ancient world, right? And how you define that today, I believe, and would be different, and I'm the only one that thinks it would be different. But theoretically, right? So if someone is outside of your covenantal community, right, to use a Rav's term, then you have no obligation to return the lost object. And so Rav Lichtenstein was talking about something that he witnessed, where there were 2 Haredi kids. They found something, and it had belonged to someone Chiloni. I mean, they could say it was a secular person, and they were debating among themselves whether they had to return it to him because
he's not within
their fold. Within their fold, and of course, in the end, that they decided to return it to him, and he thought that was the correct decision. But what he admired was the fact that in the Haredi world, the children would have that discussion, and in the Dati Leumi world, in the national religious world, I don't say modern Orthodox because Israel is different, right? But in the more modern circles, they wouldn't even have that discussion. They might just intuitively return it without that discussion. And he thought it was virtuous to have that discussion. Mm-hmm. And there's something about that really rubbed me the wrong way. And that also just went into, because we idealized, for good reason, we idealized Rav Lichtenstein. We really did. He was a great man. But that, and I don't think he was actually like that in terms of that story, but it struck me that the question is, now I can look at it and say, what about it irked me, it struck me that where is the legal analysis and where are the healthy moral intuitions? Right? How do they talk to each other? Right? And this goes back to the question of how we understand the place of God in the world, where the assumption of the way he told that anecdote is that, of course, God is in the second chapter of Bava Metzia, which talks about the laws of returning the object.
He's found more in the legal analysis.
So that's what he admires. So that is primary. And he has a faith that will not lead to immoral conclusions, right? You can question that faith, but that's not the issue here. And that's why he would admire in the children having that discussion. And the way I felt, which I can now formulate with then I couldn't,
right,
was that no, the falling back to the legal discussion is sort of a tragic thing. It's because the healthy intuitions have been dulled that then you have to be told what to do. But a healthy person would know what to do and would not need to arrive at okay, what's the halacha here? What do I need to do? So the order is inverted, right? Because the personal sentiment was in the view of what the yeshiva had translated from the Lithuanian worldview. The personal sentiment is relegated. Like, who cares what you think? What does the halacha say, right? Where I think it's a very naive way of looking at what the halacha is. But the halacha is a creation of the human interaction that occurs between the human beings, how they read their tradition, how they read the text, but not the text, it's not necessarily the text narrowly defined, but how they read the text of their tradition and the text of themselves.
You're saying that the law is already inscribed with the human beings who encoded it, and that their sentiments, their moral feelings, their intuitions are already bleeding into the text itself.
Right.
So to read the text as somehow apart from those intuitions is foolish.
It's naive.
Right. So a person could ask a question here, because this is a fundamental discussion in religion, which is the relationship between a kind of divinely commanded morality, or at least a halachically commanded morality, and natural intuition. Though the kind of view from the pews would be that is a kind of what we used to call in grad school the hermeneutics of suspicion, meaning if you have a point of view, we suspect that because you're filled with your own fragilities, your own biases, you're a human being.
Right.
And that the really default Jewish position should be that we would defer to what the law says, because that's more of a pure filter of what the tradition, God, the rabbis would say, and in fact, your intuition should follow rather than precede. But you don't seem to be seeing it that way.
No. I think it's more complicated than that. I think that the tradition is a living and breathing phenomena. It's a product of human endeavor and interaction with its own tradition and with the world around it. And as a matter of faith, this you can only attest to as a matter of faith, some sort of encounter with God in that. Okay? And that's a matter of faith. You can prove that, and I think it's important to put that, to understand that.
Right.
And I think it's important to minimize the role that plays so that we take responsibility for our part in it. Right? So I think whereas people used to say that if you psychologize, right, if you attribute psychological motivations to halachic decision making, that undermines the system. Now, I believe that if you attribute psychological motivations to what you see in the halakha, in order to undermine it, then it undermines it, right? But if you understand that this is the encounter that Jewish civilization has had with a divine moment, and this is how it's translated, then it's something totally different.
Right. Although for some people that might be just too destabilizing. They have a fairly binary view of how things work, which is that God gives Torah. Torah is received by sort of superior human beings, prophets, sages, and so on. And, we, standing on the shoulders of giants, receive a little bit of that. And our job is basically to faithfully record it and transmit it and not to impute any kind of... well, here it gets murky because there's obviously a humanness involved in it.
Right.
But it's a different kind of humanness. Like they're different humans than we are, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. So I think that's very naive. Yes, there are people like that. I agree with you. There are people like that. Right. I think that
it's naive to think that the great sages of the past were not motivated by psychology. You're saying?
Right. They're human beings, but I believe that doesn't take away
from their accomplishments.
From their accomplishments and their greatness. Actually, it adds to it because if someone is an angel, but this has to do with, the art scroll view of the world, right? All the stories, all the Gedolim stories, the stories of great sages. They work very hard at painting these pictures of perfection. So it seems like it's more religious, but it's really very undermining because then. If Rabbi Kiva Eger or the Chasam Sofer, they were like perfect human beings, so they don't challenge me. So they were them, and I can be my own self with all my flaws. You can't really expect anything from me, right? So it's sort of an abrogation of responsibility, and this goes back. There's this whole discussion primarily here in Israel about Tanakh B'Gova Ha'inayim, right? We're viewing how you view the characters in Tanakh, the heroes, not the villains, right? But how you view them. Do you view them as people beyond reproach? So
talking about Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov,
Yaakov, Moshe, Aaron, David, Shlomo, right?
We treat them. That's the great paradox, right? If we treat them as superior, so. Not only is it hard to learn from people who are beyond your ken, but also it doesn't jibe with their imperfect actions, so we say, in the text. And if we treat them as imperfect, so then you're undermining the mythos that they're somehow special and different than me. This is the difficulty of the negotiation, I think.
But you can be a flawed individual and still be very different than me. And you can be greater than me. Because of the flaws that you struggle with and how you emerge from them.
What would you say if a student came to you and said, let's say a completely naive tabula rasa person comes to the text, they're reading Genesis, and they're reading about, Yaakov, Jacob, all sorts of things that not only are you different than me, but actually I wouldn't do this and I wouldn't teach this to my kid. Right. The sneaking suspicion that not only are you different, you're not even as good as the morality of some people I know. If somebody said that to you, what would you say?
Well, let me not respond to Yaakov. I'll say something within my family, right? I have a son who's going to be bar mitzvah this year. So my wife was studying Nevi'im Rishonim with him, the first books of the prophets, and she went through the book of Joshua. It's pretty brutal.
Yes. So
at some point, what do you want to teach your 12-year-old about warfare, about in Israel, these are as long as Jews lived in Poland or in Brooklyn before the state of Israel, these were very theoretical things, and you could imagine what it would be like to have a Jewish army and how you would exercise your authority or your military prowess against your enemies. Right? But these questions are very practical. They're halakha l'maaseh in the state of Israel. So the book of Joshua, when I studied it in elementary school, was innocuous, right? The boundaries didn't mean anything. There were places that could have been Narnia, right? But there wasn't Narnia. It was this faraway place, right?
Yeah.
And the way the soldiers behaved was then, right? And somehow you in elementary school didn't think about it again, and the teachers didn't raise the question: What does this mean? What morally about wiping out a civilian population and all these type of questions? But in Israel, people want to base, unfortunately, their political parties that want to base foreign policy and domestic policy on the Bible, right? And that is nothing less than insane. So then how do you teach living in Efrat? Right? How do you teach the Bible? What type of ethos do you teach your 12-year-old who someday is going to be a soldier?
So what do you say to your 12-year-old? This is your sixth of six children.
The
right?
six out of six. He's the last go-round, and he's learning, and he's studying the book of Joshua.
Did he actually ask you questions about this? Was he morally troubled, or were you morally troubled for him?
I think he gets it, but he gets it from us. Right? I have other kids. Some of the kids get it. Some of the kids bring it to us, and they get it before us. And some of them we have to bring it, imbibe it from you, and it's hard to know. And that's actually also a signal that how people see things is not simple. What did he get from himself, and what did he get from us, and what did he get from school, and all that he brings to the table, to his horizon when he meets Joshua. Right? So it's not simple. It's not that he's looking at the text. What does the text tell him, and how does he have to treat his moral intuitions? It's like, what are his moral intuitions in relationship to the text, in relationship to who he is, in relationship to what he heard at home, what we told him, what we told him not verbally, what he picked up, good things, bad things. Is complicated.
So a priori, it seems to me you're communicating that you should never suppress your moral intuitions. You have to encounter the text with your moral intuitions front and center. Then it's a question of what happens next.
I think there's a very famous Tikkunei Zohar that I first heard quote from Rav Amital, but Rav Tzadok Hakomi Lublin likes to quote it a lot.
This is the 19th century.
A 19th century Hasidic master. He died in 1900.
Okay.
The Tikkunei Zohar says that there are 600,000 letters in the Torah, comparable to the 600,000 who left Egypt, right? It doesn't matter that there are really 300,000 letters in the Torah, and he was aware of that also. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
So what does that mean? What it means, if I'm a letter in a Sefer Torah, and if you're a letter in a Sefer Torah, it means we're a piece of divine revelation, right? We're a piece of it, right? And that means you're part of what needs to be interpreted. When we're coming to make some sort of decision, and it doesn't have to be like that I'm posek and I'm formally issuing a decision, but there are all sorts of decisions that we make where I want to understand the sugya, right? So I'll pull out the books from the shelf. So I have the Gemara, and I have the Mishnah, and I have the Tosefta, and I have the Tosfot, and I have the Ritva, and I have the Achronim, and I have the Halacha, depending on what type of question I'm dealing with, and I put that all into sort of I call like the chulent of considerations, right? Right, so I have to square it all, and I have to work it out, and I come to some sort of balance, what gravitas I give to every source, and what works out the best, and I come to some sort of working arrangement for all my sources.
Yeah.
But what needs to be thrown in front and center into that chulent is yourself, because you're also one of the sources. Like, nobody ever asks, so how do you feel about this Tosfot? I'm not saying that how you feel trumps everything. Right? I'm not saying that.
Yeah, I understand.
But it has to be brought into the conversation because you're also a creation of your tradition. So you're that letter in the Sefer Torah that needs explication.
Right. So you're talking about a certain kind of fluidity in a way, in a lot of things, not to have these like sort of neat binaries.
Neat binaries.
Right. So I wanted to talk about...
You could say there are two types of people in the world. People who see in neat binaries and people who don't.
Well, and everybody in between, you know.
But I just did a binary. That was
one of the binaries that we have in Jewish tradition that you're sort of famous or infamous for approaching is the idea of who should be a rabbi in the Orthodox tradition. Until modernity, that was essentially, really until post-modernity, that we're talking about men exclusively. And one of the things you did a few years ago, I guess it's 3 years ago now, is you ordained women, giving them Orthodox... Together with Rabbi Daniel Sperber, you gave them ordination, right? You as an Orthodox rabbi, as a Talmid Chacham, and without getting into, you know, the kind of journalism of it, you know, those who opposed and all sorts of stuff being said about you. Maybe you can go through your thought process about why it came to you that this is something you want to do, that you should do, and how you feel about it now.
Well, the way it came about, I think I'll share how I thought about it as it was coming about. I did not plan to, when I grow up, to give smicha to women. That wasn't where I necessarily saw things going. What happened was there was a group which congealed here in Yerushalayim, which I was teaching once a week. I was teaching them Yeridea, the laws of kashrut. It was a voluntary thing. People who wanted to study with me came. It was men and women. The person that initiated the group just asked me, can women come also? Should it be a group of men and women? So I just said yes, without thinking about it twice. And I'm happy that I didn't have to think about it, that I didn't think about it twice. And we were studying, and towards some of the students were interested in getting smicha, but some of them weren't. It was just Torah for Torah's sake, rather than getting some sort of ritualistic recognition. That's what I'll call smicha. But there were two men who were interested in getting smicha out of the group, and two former students of mine from Midrash at Lindenbaum were also in the group, women who had been studying Torah for more than 20 years, teaching, studying. And they asked me early on, do you think we can get smicha also? So I was 55 at the time, right? I don't know, at some point you feel too old to be putting up with a lot of things. I think that's a good maturation process, where maybe when you're in your 20s, you're trying to break into something, which we talked about in the beginning. And in your 30s, you're happy that you broke in and you're in it. And your 40s, you're beginning to think about it. And by the time you reach 50, you're finished in terms of what other people think.
You're not obsessed with being part of the club.
You're not obsessed with being part of the club.
But what was your initial reaction when they?
My initial reaction was, of course, they should be able to have smicha. Of course, like I couldn't, and I still, honestly, don't see why not.
In terms of, you don't see any legal problem.
There's certainly no halachic problem, and I think I actually primarily view it as a moral issue, and even a human rights issue in a certain sense. But so my response to them was, of course, you should be able to get smicha. But smicha is about recognition. And it's not something which is normative in the Orthodox community. I don't like talking about Orthodox, it's too narrowing, but just for the sake of sociology, I'm going to use the term Orthodox. It's even less applicable here in Israel,
right.
But it's something which is not normative. So, and if, as they say, kol hakavod, right? If I give you smicha, it's not going to do anything for you, right? But I said, I'll speak to Rabbi Sperber, because I knew what he thought about it already. But I'll speak to him. I have a connection with him for over many years. And if he agrees to do it together with me, then we'll go ahead. So I spoke to him, and I said, if I bring you students, men and women, and I test them in halachic material, and you test them in whatever you want to test them in, and we think that they're worthy of getting smicha, will you grant smicha together with me? So he agreed, and I went back to the two women, and I said, okay. And they actually didn't believe me. So we did it. But we did it, and so what motivated me, what allowed me to do that, where it's clearly, forget about the halachic considerations, because I don't think that they're really, they don't really exist, right? Many halachic objections can be raised, but they're just, I believe, smoke screens for the real issue. And the real issue is tradition. That's why I actually agree with the OU document that fundamentally framed the discussion in their words in terms of Masorah. Right? I actually agree with the framing of that.
You agree that
that's the way to frame it, because let's talk about it in terms of tradition.
Right.
Okay.
You didn't agree with their conclusions.
I didn't, and I wrote something about it. But I really disagree with their conclusions. But I thought that they were actually honest enough to place Masorah front and center. Because I also think Masorah is extremely important. Right? But then you have to bring, just like you would bring a passage from the Talmud into discussion with yourself. You're the letter in the Sefer Torah. you have to bring that tradition. Now, whether halachically is considered a tradition is also, I don't want to get into that discussion. Something not happening, whether that can generate a tradition. Let's put that aside, right? But beyond the doubt, it's certainly not traditional, right? I won't say that it is a tradition only to have men rabbis, but it's certainly not traditional to have women rabbis. Let's put it that way, right? And that just to say anything else and to point to Bruria and to
the scattered examples.
Right, the scattered examples actually prove the point that it's not
that
it's not that it's not traditional, which is actually one of the things that appears in the OU document. But so what allows me, one person, right, to attempt to change who gets smicha when it's been one way for thousands of years? At least 2,000 years. What happened before then, nobody really knows. But let's say, right? Let's say 3,000 years. Let's say from 1200, from 1244 BCE, when the Bible was given on whatever. So I think that there are a number of considerations. One consideration is, what do I feel deeply is right? It's not the only consideration, right? Because it can't be totally subjective, right? You need a good dose of humility in situations like this, right? But the first thing that I meet in encountering this discussion is myself. And it just seemed inexcusable or unconscionable that two human beings should go through the same process of study. And it's not just a question of intellectual study, the same process of education in the broad sense, and that one should be given recognition and the other should be denied recognition. That just seemed basically immoral. And I still, when I think about it today, I just can't understand it. I can make the argument otherwise, but I don't really understand it. Right?
But don't we have a tradition that in some ways is constantly denying people recognition? Not on, obviously in individual select examples. I just conducted a whole live event here in Jerusalem where hundreds of people came talking about LGBT, and they feel that their sort of almost innate form of sexual expression is denied, it's not recognized by the tradition. I'm not here to talk about that whole area, but simply to raise the fact that is this really so unusual Jewishly that that some kinds of recognitions are selective?
Look, I think that every instance is different. And since we're not going to get into LGBT discussion,
right,
I think that the question exists there as well, and that has to be dealt with in a very serious way. Jewish tradition, Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg once used this phrase, which resonated with me very strongly, is an interpretive tradition. Right? It's sort of like Heraclitus is stepping into the river, that you never step into the same river twice. But that is what's constant. What's constant is that you never step into the same, is the inconstancy. So Jewish tradition is interpretive. It is constantly evolving from what came before it. Right? It's not every moment is totally different than every other moment. There is an organic development. And I think that in terms of a very serious issue in terms of recognizing people's sexual identity, I think that discussion has to happen with tradition, with a great deal of originality and boldness. Right? Much less of that is required in this case.
Right,
okay? In other words, they're not the same, right? They're not the same.
Can I rehearse something for you?
Yeah.
Let's say you're a Martian and
for a Martian,
you don't even need a Martian. I'm the Martian here, right? The outsider, I'm not even an outsider, and it's confusing to me. The relationship between permanence and fluidity, between eternity And what you're saying is, I came to this, and I felt morally that it was untenable.
Let me continue that, right? So we're talking about when I encountered this issue.
Yeah.
What operated upon me in order to let me do what I did? Right? That was the question. Okay? So the first thing that I encounter is myself. Now, the second thing I encounter is I'm alone. Right? If it's just myself, again, it's fluid in the sense that every question is different. So there's me, and there's the weight of my letter in the Sefer Torah as part of the whole Sefer Torah. Right? The weight that one letter has, which I am not at liberty to discard. Right? There's a responsibility here. Right? I really feel that I did not have a choice. Right? So there's a responsibility that I feel I have. But then again, there's what was until now, and there's my teachers and everything I learned and how that fits in with that. So what I need to do then is to search out people to collaborate with, so that it's not just me, and that I can know as much as you can know, right? That I'm not alone. It doesn't mean that there aren't people that disagree, but depending on the severity of the instance, that there's enough for me to go on, right?
And if nobody had been there, if you'd been
I don't
alone,
think I could have done it.
Couldn't have done it.
I couldn't have done it, and I wouldn't have done it. Right?
So the fact that the vast majority of the Orthodox world opposed it was not as significant to you as the fact that there were
a few significant people that were with me and thought that it was a positive thing. Right. No, it's not a question of numbers. It's not how many people do you need to give women smicha. How many people do you need to have a homosexual marriage? It's not the same. It's not the same thing, right? Sometimes you need a heter rabbanim, and sometimes you need collaboration, and sometimes the case may be so severe, and you may feel so moved that you'd go it alone. That also happens, right? Those are very extreme circumstances. Every case is different. But the way I evaluated the situation was that if I have, they call it a few good men, a few good people that I could collaborate with, consult with, and we felt that this was the right thing, then I felt that I must do it. I felt a responsibility. I did not feel that I could free myself of the obligation to do the right thing, and then come what may.
I think that what you're talking about, is also reflected in some of your main spiritual interests at this point, because you've really shifted. You've told me privately that the real action for you emotionally and spiritually is not necessarily learning Talmud and codes, but rather the world of Hasidut, the world of Hasidic thinking, and especially the world of one specific 19th century figure, Rabbi Mordechai Leiner, known by his pen name, the Mei HaShiloach. Tell me what it is that draws you to this individual, and tell me what it is that has influenced your religious worldview. Just an example of the way your worldview has been influenced by this study.
That's a very big question.
So I'm just going to give you a small taste.
An application, basically the response that I gave you about how it came to be that I moved ahead with Smicha for Women. There's a piece in the Mei HaShiloach where he discusses the relationship between Moshe and the tribal leaders in the desert. Where the tribal leaders in the desert, this is in Parshat Naso, where the tribal leaders in the desert see the difficult circumstances of the Leviim, where they have to schlep the Mishkan.
The Levites have to
drag the Mishkan through the desert to bring it to Eretz Yisrael, and there's no one to help them. And that's what moves the tribal leaders to bring the oxen and the wagons to load the pieces of the Mishkan on board in order to help the Leviim drag it. Right? And the dynamic that occurs there is that they, of their own voluntary spirit, bring the materials to help transport the Mishkan. And since everything in the desert is al pi Hashem biyad Moshe, everything is divine edict in the desert when it comes to the Mishkan, and to violate that is death, right? Their initiative is not welcome. Moshe Rabbeinu receives the initiative with a great deal of suspicion, and he refused to accept it because he doesn't understand where it's coming from. And the Nesiim themselves, the tribal leaders themselves, have to undergo this. He describes this, or an internal process of introspection and clarification, which he calls Beirur, in order to check their own motivations. Because maybe God, so to speak, doesn't want, in quotation, God wants is a naive way of speaking, but we just talk that way. Maybe God doesn't want the Levium to have help. Maybe they need the physical labor for themselves, and that's somehow edifying for them. And then the good intentions of the tribal leaders to help them are misplaced and actually could be disastrous, because then they're actually sabotaging the efforts to bring the Mishkan to the land. So they have to look inside themselves and say, what is it? Why are we doing this? Is it because we just feel compassion? Or is this compassion a divine revelation for us? And the way they reach their conclusion to be certain enough to take action and offer the oxen and the wagons is the collaboration. It's as if the head of the tribe of Shimon said to the head of the tribe of Reuven, look at how much the Levium are suffering. It's hot in the desert and it's hard work. We should do something to help them. And then the head of the tribe of Reuven said, I was thinking the same thing. And when that moment occurs, right, that gets interpreted, because they're interpreting themselves, that gets interpreted as a divine revelation. It's a piece of the Torah, right? And that allows them to take action based on that. And that's something that Moshe Rabbeinu, in this model, doesn't understand until God reveals himself to Moshe and says, yes, accept it. And the way we accept it, it's from them. It's their initiative, but their initiative as a divine revelation. It has to come as a human initiative, which is a divine revelation. So what speaks to me is the bringing together of the human and the divine, which is what the Torah really is. And I think that it's naive, right? Go back to a certain type of epistemological naivete, right? That there's the Torah out there, and there's us over here, and we can know it or not know it based on our efforts, right? And there's this gap in between us and the Torah, which is this secular chasm which we have to overcome, right? So that last formulation really doesn't speak to me, right? What speaks to me is an organic model of God in the world and God, and primarily God in human consciousness. Because I think you would never have really anything else.
But you could understand, returning to what I asked before, it's confusing on some level to know the parameters of this and the specifics of it.
Right.
How do we discern or unravel that which is a kind of impulse which might be contrary to the sort of best spiritual conclusions, where I'm sort of thrusting myself in there for all sorts of reasons? How do I know that this is an upholding of what is eternal or an overturning of what is eternal?
The how do I know is the question, right? I have a friend who's a Breslover Hasid, and before he became Frum, he was a kung fu champion here in Israel, who said, life is an extreme sport, right? In other words, you never know. You can only do as best you can, right? And that's true no matter what. Whether you choose to ignore that and tell yourself that you know, that's your business, right? But you never really do know. So what this approach calls for is taking responsibility for it, right? And meaning you cannot absolve yourself from that introspection, from that soul searching, from that necessary collaboration, from that judgment call that you need to make in a unique circumstance. You cannot absolve yourself from that and say, well, I don't know, so I'm going to do what it says. But that's also, see, there's this illusion that being conservative with a small c is safe, and You're only taking chances if you're trying to innovate. But that goes back to Heraclitus. There's nothing that's really safe, and there's nothing that's really stationary. The status quo doesn't really exist, right? It's an illusion. So it's not really safe to say, well, I won't do anything. Because deciding not to do anything is also deciding to do something.
Why couldn't somebody step in there and take your insight and make it more radical and say, you really shouldn't step in the same river twice? So all of the things, I understand that like ancient Jews used to keep this, that, and the other, but it's completely not consonant with my values. I'll give you one sort of concrete example, which is the laws of Nidah, family purity, right? You look at them. If you want to be an anthropologist, you would say this is an ancient blood taboo. It's a hang-up of various
Men
cultures.
looked at menstrual blood and they flipped.
And they flipped, you know? And so, you know, really, the truth is I've searched out my intuition, and my letter in the Torah completely rebels against this. It makes no sense to me at all. I guess, so somebody who's on the small c conservative end would say, I think rightly would ask, where are we going to draw the lines now that our moral intuitions are engaged? Because certainly, you know, the case of women rabbis actually pales in comparison to certain other cases of sexual orientation, let's say,
right.
or the laws of let's just keep it.
I think that's what gets people scared.
Right.
I think if we were living in a vacuum and women were getting smicha, I don't think anybody would care.
Right.
Right.
But let's take the case of Nida. Somebody comes to you and says, this is absurd, right? In so many ways. I'm being constrained sexually, I lose spontaneity in my marriage, and anyway, the source of it is absurd, right? So now, don't you find yourself now on the downslope? In other words, you've created this idea that now springs back and says to you, well, what about this? What about this? What about this?
Well, that's why I was very careful in my formulation, that it doesn't begin and end with your own. It's not just about me, right? It's not just about my personal inclinations. The significance of culture is that you could say cultural information in the broad sense, not in terms of data, right? But human experience is beyond the experience of one human being. It's communicated horizontally to all the people alive on the planet currently, and it's communicated vertically through the culmination of human civilization. And I'm part of a civilization, right, which is the Jewish civilization. So nobody can, it's like the old man and the elephant. The world is much bigger than me. And that's a basic lesson that people have to understand. The world is bigger than me. I get a piece of it, but I cannot ignore the piece of it that you get, or the piece of it that my grandmother got, or my great-grandfather got. So I'm responsible to all of that. And that means that you need, in addition, again, you're not free to absolve yourself from looking at yourself. But that's the beginning, it's not the end. So if somebody comes and tells me, well, they think that this group of halachot is not relevant because it was an ancient taboo, it might have been an ancient taboo, it was an ancient taboo, right? But the question of faith becomes, was it an ancient taboo because God somehow was in the consciousness of human beings, and that somehow is supposed to be part of our consciousness today, that we inherited that and we translated that into a certain code of law, right? That has to do with feeling part of your civilization. So there's you and how you feel about it, and bring that into conversation, right? But it's part of the conversation, right? If you say that it's all about me, then you're putting yourself on an island that you're totally subjective. If it works for you, I don't judge other people.
Right.
But I don't think that has a value for other people.
And I would assume, finally, that you would extend these pieces to other faiths as well. I know that you're interested in Eastern traditions and Hinduism. What do you feel they bring to the table for you as an observant Jew?
I think they bring interiority. This is something that Peter Berger, we discussed, right? This is something that Peter Berger brought to the table in the Heretical Imperative, where in the West, God became a God of history, an exterior God. And even in terms of the religious experience, God who you encounter as an exterior personality that challenges you, that loves you, that rebukes you. So there's a very powerful encounter. Mm-hmm. The Eastern model, which also exists in Western mysticism, right?
Yes.
But the Eastern model is much more organic. God is less in thinking and more in being. So I think that type of interiority that the East brings, which exists in Western traditions, and if I'm interested primarily in my own tradition, right, I'm interested in Judaism and in the Torah and Hasidut, it exists there. And somehow when you see something from another tradition, you recognize it more readily than in your own tradition. And then it can embolden it in your own tradition. So that's the value of it for me.
Yafeh.
Okay. All right.
Thank you very much.
All right.